What if inflation did spike up the way the government measures it to 4 or 5%? Would they do anything? No. What are they going to do? Are they going to jack up interest rates to 6 or 7 or 8%? Of course not. They can't do anything. So the only thing they can really do is continue to put out bogus inflation statistics. Because if they ever showed that inflation was above their target, and then they didn't do anything to bring it back down because it's impossible, because they would prick the bubbles. I mean, imagine what would happen to the housing market, to corporate sector with all the debt they have. What would happen to the government itself if the government had to pay a higher rate of interest on the enormity of this $19 trillion national debt and rising? And in fact, the budget deficits now have just taken a big turn higher, and that trend is going to continue. And I think already Barack Obama might have doubled the national debt since he was sworn in. And I pointed this out. I mean, we doubled the debt, doubled it, right? That means we added as much debt under Obama as we did from George Washington to George W. Bush. And of course, if this continues, the next president is going to double the 19 trillion. To what, 40 trillion? I mean, that's impossible, right? So there has to be a crisis somewhere along the way. There's no way we can continue on this trajectory, but we have to continue on this trajectory in order to prevent everything from imploding. That's the problem. The bigger the debt, the bigger the economy is based on debt, the more debt we need to sustain the growth. So we have to be able to grow this thing on that trajectory, which is impossible, which is why it's all going to come to an end. The only hope the government has is inflation. That's their only, all they can do is try to inflate everything so that the numbers go up, so that the debt comes down relative to the larger economy, but only in an inflationary sense. It's not real economic growth, but they've got to make prices go up. So they've got everybody convinced that inflation is a good thing. But the crisis that's going to come, ultimately, the dollar crisis is going to come when the Federal Reserve has to allow inflation well above their 2% target, and they do nothing to rein it in. And that's when the markets perceive that there's a problem here, because the Fed, talking about reining in inflation is one thing, but when they're forced to actually, back up their words with actions and they fail to do it because they can't do it, that's when you have a run on the dollar. That's when you have the real collapse in the currency. And that's what's ultimately going to come. But before that happens, the dollar has a long way to drop before it's going to push the CPI to a level that will finally show the extent to which prices are rising. Because so far, governments are pretty capable of disguising this. The methodology for reporting prices is so flawed now that you really have to have a dramatic amount of inflation before any of it shows up in an official measure.